Emma was 23. He was 35. She was just an American student who had come to Scotland to study medieval architecture. He was the billionaire owner of a 15th-century castle, still wounded by the betrayal of his ex-wife. What was supposed to be just 1 week of academic research turned into 6 months of passion that defied every difference between them. And when she realized she could choose between a safe life of solitary achievements or the most intense love that ever existed, everything changed forever. Comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel, because this story has it all. Medieval castles, unforgettable first times, and a love that proved some age differences are just numbers when hearts recognize each other. The parchment envelope arrived on a September morning in Vermont. Just as the leaves began to turn gold and the air carried promises of change Emma couldn't yet imagine. She was in the small wooden kitchen of the house where she'd grown up, stirring scrambled eggs for her father's breakfast. He'd been working since 5 a.m. on the 300-acre farm the family had run for 3 generations. She saw the international seal and her heart raced before she even opened it. The letter was from the Scottish Historical Heritage Council, printed on heavy letterhead that smelled of formality and opportunities too big for a small town girl still wearing the hiking boots she'd received as a high school graduation gift. "Dear Miss Sullivan," began the letter in formal English, which she read 3 times before believing it was truly addressed to her. "We are pleased to inform you that your research proposal on medieval defensive architecture has been accepted by the Scotland Heritage Foundation Academic Exchange Program. You have been selected to conduct an intensive field study on 15th-century fortification systems with a specific focus on Ravenshollow Castle, a private estate that houses some of the best preserved examples of late Gothic military engineering in the Highlands region." Emma had to sit down on a wooden chair that creaked under the weight of her surprise, her hands trembling slightly as she continued reading details about accommodation, 1-week duration, full access to historical archives, and a scholarship that would cover all expenses. 3 weeks later, she was at Burlington Airport with 2 suitcases packed for 7 days in Scotland and a nervous flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with flying for the first time. It was all about leaving the only home she'd ever known in search of something she couldn't yet name. The family farm had started to feel small after years of studying bigger worlds in books, after discovering that intelligence could be a passport to places that seemed to exist only in photographs, after realizing that architecture could tell the stories of entire civilizations through every stone placed with deliberate purpose. Her father, Thomas Sullivan, stood beside the boarding gate with that proud and worried expression he'd worn since she got a full scholarship to the University of Vermont. "Are you sure you don't want me to come with you? This whole thing about staying on a private estate with strangers." His voice carried all the paternal protection of a man who had raised his daughter alone after her mother died when Emma was just 8. She felt that familiar pang of guilt mixed with determination that always came when she chose academia over family safety. "Dad, I'll be fine. It's an official research project, supervised by the university, and the castle's owner has an impeccable reputation in academic circles." She said it trying to sound more confident than she felt, because the truth was she knew almost nothing about Alexander Ravenshollow beyond what she'd found online. Heir to a financial empire, Oxford graduate in art history, owner of one of Europe's most important private collections of medieval art, the 12-hour flight to Edinburgh was an eternity of growing nerves mixed with excitement that made her stomach flip with every bit of turbulence, every thought about what awaited her across the ocean. Emma spent hours staring out the window at clouds that looked like floating mountains of cotton, imagining what it would be like to step onto Scottish soil, to see up close the stones she'd studied in books throughout her specialized undergraduate years. She had memorized every available detail about Ravenshollow Castle, built in 1347 by Clan MacLeod, expanded in the 15th century with unique defensive elements including a system of secret passages, interconnected watchtowers, and a treasure room carved into solid rock that served as a final refuge during prolonged sieges. When the plane finally landed in Edinburgh on a gray morning that smelled of rain and antiquity, Emma felt like she was stepping into another temporal dimension, where every breath carried centuries of lived history. The airport was modern, but there was something in the air, in the accents of the people, in the way light filtered through the windows that confirmed she was truly on the other side of the world. Alone for the first time in her life, about to live an adventure she'd dreamed of since childhood when she realized she loved history more than dolls. The driver waiting for her at the exit held a sign with her name written in elegant calligraphy, and Emma discovered that the simple act of being expected in a foreign country could be both comforting and terrifying. The drive from Edinburgh to the Highlands took 4 hours, through landscapes that looked like they'd come straight out of the fairy tale, books she used to read under the covers as a child. Rolling hills covered in purple heather stretched to the horizon. Lochs reflected skies heavy with clouds that changed shape every mile, and sheep-dotted green fields like tufts of cotton scattered by a distracted giant. Emma stayed glued to the window the entire trip, mentally photographing every detail because she knew she'd return to Vermont with stories no one would fully believe. With memories that would have to last years until she could save enough money to return to Europe. Ravenshollow Castle appeared on the horizon like a mirage of gray stone rising against the sky as if it had grown out of the mountain itself. Its towers pierced the low clouds, and its walls stretched across rugged terrain that spoke of centuries of defense against invaders from both land and sea. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the car climbed the winding road to the main gate, flanked by watchtowers still showing arrow slits and carved gargoyles that seemed to watch every movement with stone eyes that had seen more history than she could imagine. The walls were 5 meters high and 2 meters thick, built from gray granite blocks cut and fitted with a precision that defied the technological limitations of the 14th century. The car stopped before a wrought iron gate that opened automatically, revealing an inner courtyard paved with stones polished by centuries of traffic, surrounded by 3-story buildings that blended Gothic elements with Renaissance additions. The architecture formed a harmony Emma had studied in theory, but never seen in practice. There were formal gardens arranged in geometric patterns that were works of art in themselves, with marble fountains singing watery music among rose bushes that released fragrances, mixing with the scent of ancient stone and accumulated time. A team of uniformed staff waited to receive her, led by a middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Margaret, the head housekeeper who managed the estate with a gentle authority that spoke of decades caring for a home that was also a museum, a residence and a family legacy. Miss Sullivan, welcome to Ravenshollow Castle. Margaret spoke with a Scottish accent full of genuine hospitality that immediately made Emma feel less alone in the world. Mr. Alexander is in a meeting in London, but will return tomorrow to meet you personally. Until then, I've been instructed to ensure you have everything you need to begin your research. The housekeeper guided Emma through hallways that were medieval art galleries, with Flemish tapestries hanging between full suits of armor that had belonged to knights whose names were engraved on polished bronze plaques, stained glass windows painted colorful, rainbows across marble floors that reflected light like ancient mirrors, and period furniture that was museum-worthy, yet still functional after centuries of careful use. Her assigned room was in the East Tower, on the 3rd floor, with windows offering panoramic views of the Scottish mountains stretching as far as the eye could see, dotted with lakes that sparkled like jewels set in green velvet. The bed had a carved wooden canopy likely crafted before America was even discovered, with navy velvet curtains that could be drawn to create a private world. There was a stone fireplace, already stocked with wood for when the temperature dropped. Emma discovered the bathroom was a marvel of modernity, disguised in antiquity, with a marble bathtub that looked carved from a single block of stone, and a shower offering perfect pressure hidden behind panels that preserved the medieval aesthetic. The first night was a blend of excitement and solitude that kept her awake until late, gazing out the window at the moonlit mountains. The full moon turned the landscape into a painting of silver and deep shadows. Emma had never felt so small, and yet so connected to something greater than herself, sleeping in a bed that might have hosted kings, in a castle that had survived wars, plagues, and political shifts that reshaped entire continents. She fell asleep thinking of her father, probably checking on the cattle at a farm that now felt like it belonged to another planet. She dreamed of knights riding through stone corridors, carrying flags that fluttered in winds that had blown for centuries. Morning arrived with the smell of bacon and eggs rising from the kitchen, mixed with the scent of fresh bread and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Emma came downstairs to find a breakfast that looked like it belonged in a film about European aristocracy. It was served in a dining room with a massive wooden table that could seat 20, and windows overlooking gardens where peacocks strolled among rose bushes like models in a home decor magazine shoot. Margaret explained that the estate employed 15 full-time staff for maintenance, gardening, cooking, and security. Mr. Alexander visited the castle about once a month but kept it running like a primary residence because he believed historic places. So when they're not regularly inhabited, Emma spent her first day exploring the library, which occupied 2 full floors of the North Tower. It held over 20,000 volumes, including medieval manuscripts, first editions on Gothic architecture, original maps showing the evolution of fortifications over the centuries, and historical documents recounting battles and sieges that had taken place within the very walls she could now touch. There were rolling ladders of varnished wood gliding along bronze rails to reach shelves that climbed to the vaulted ceiling. Reading tables were lit by lamps that blended modern technology with medieval design, and leather armchairs were comfortable enough to spend entire hours immersed in research that felt more like adventure than academic work. On the second afternoon, she was examining original blueprints of the castle when she heard the helicopter landing in the outer courtyard. Its sound echoed between the walls like controlled thunder. Margaret appeared in the library with that discreet smile that competent housekeepers wear when they know something important is about to happen. Miss Sullivan, Mr. Alexander has arrived and would like to meet you before dinner. If you're available. Emma felt her stomach twist with nerves that had nothing to do with shyness and everything to do with curiosity about the man who owned this magical place, the man who had made her dream of studying medieval architecture on site possible, the man with a reputation for being both brilliant in business and passionate about history. She went up to her room to change out of her casual sweater into something more appropriate for meeting a billionaire. She chose a simple yet elegant navy blue dress that matched her eyes and highlighted her red hair without looking like she was trying too hard, though she knew she was absolutely trying to make a good first impression. Emma descended the stone stairs feeling like she was walking toward her own destiny, though she couldn't imagine how a courtesy meeting would change everything she had planned for her life. Alexander Ravenshollow stood in the main hall before the fireplace, where flames crackled, releasing the scent of aged wood and warmth that fought the natural chill of stone. Emma paused at the entrance, feeling as if she had just collided with a force of nature disguised as a civilized man. He was 35, but wore his age like fine wine, only improving with time. Tall enough to command any room without effort. Broad-shouldered in a gray cashmere sweater that probably cost more than the used car she drove in Vermont. There was something in his posture that spoke of refined education mixed with natural authority, the kind passed down through generations accustomed to leading both companies in battles. But it was his eyes that truly unraveled her, blue-gray like ocean storms, intelligent in a way that saw far more than it should, and filled with a melancholy she recognized, a self-imposed solitude, though for entirely different reasons. He turned when he heard her enter, and Emma saw his expression shift subtly as he looked at her, as if she was different from what he had expected in a way he couldn't immediately categorize. Miss Sullivan, his voice carried a refined British accent that turned every word into a sensory experience, deep enough to be felt in the chest as well as heard. He approached with movements that were economical yet graceful. Speaking of genuine confidence, Mr. Ravenshollow, thank you for welcoming me into your home. The castle is even more impressive than I imagined. Emma extended her hand to greet him and felt a jolt of electricity when he touched her. His fingers were long and elegant, soft as silk yet firm as steel. Without rings, he had removed his wedding band 6 months earlier when Victoria left with only a suitcase and a letter explaining she had fallen in love with his best friend. The touch lasted a few seconds longer than socially necessary, and Emma saw how his eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her blush slightly. It felt as if he could see through all the defenses she had, built over years of strategic solitude. I've been following your academic work, Miss Sullivan. Your thesis on medieval defense systems was particularly insightful, especially your analysis of how architectural innovations reflected changes in warfare tactics. He said this while pouring Scotch whiskey from a bottle old enough to have its own stories. Emma was surprised. He had actually read her work instead of just accepting the university's recommendation. Please call me Emma, and thank you for reading my research. I didn't expect someone with your responsibilities to have time for obscure academic literature on 14th century fortifications. There was a genuine modesty in her voice that contrasted with her obvious intelligence, and Alexander found himself intrigued by someone who was clearly brilliant, but didn't feel the need to announce it constantly. History is never obscure when you're living inside it, he replied, handing her a crystal glass that caught the firelight like liquid amber. Emma felt there were layers of meaning in that sentence that went far beyond the literal. This castle has been home to my family for nearly 7 centuries. Every stone has a story. Every room has held secrets that shaped not just our family's history, but part of Scotland's history as a nation. The genuine passion in his voice as he spoke about the castle was unmistakable, and Emma understood she wasn't speaking to just a wealthy owner. She was speaking to someone who truly understood that places like this were living museums, deserving of respect and preservation. Dinner was served in the formal dining room beneath a crystal chandelier that seemed to hold 1,000 years of history in every facet. The table was set for 2 with porcelain that looked royal, silver that gleamed like moonlight, and crystal that sang when gently touched. Margaret had prepared roasted lamb with herbs grown in the castle gardens, vegetables from the estate's own fields, and wine produced in the vineyards visible through the windows. Every ingredient came together to create a meal that was both sophisticated and comforting. Alexander proved to be a gracious host who knew how to make conversation flow naturally, shifting between topics like medieval architecture, modern art collections, and books they had both read and loved. Emma learned that he had studied art history at Oxford. Before taking over the family business, he collected medieval manuscripts as a hobby that had grown into one of the largest private collections in Europe. He had visited archaeological sites around the world because he believed understanding the past was essential to making wise decisions about the future. He learned that she had grown up on a small farm in Vermont, where luxury meant buying new books instead of borrowing them from the library. She had worked part-time jobs throughout college to supplement her scholarship, and had never traveled outside the United States before this trip. But she had dreamed of touching the same stones she read about in books since childhood. Books about castles led to an interest in architecture, which led to the realization that buildings are more than just stone and mortar. They're chronicles of human ambition, fear, love, war, all the emotions that drive people to create something meant to last beyond their own lives. Emma continued, warming up to a subject she rarely had the chance to discuss with someone who could truly understand its nuances. Every castle tells a story about what people valued enough to defend, who they trusted enough to let inside the walls, what they feared enough to build defenses. Against architecture is the autobiography of civilization. Alexander watched her face light up as she spoke and found himself thinking that Victoria had never shown this kind of passionate intelligence about anything beyond fashion and social climbing. Tomorrow I'll show you the secret passages that connect different parts of the castle, Alexander said as the night drew to a close. And Emma realized she had spent hours talking to someone who was essentially a stranger, without feeling any of the social anxiety that usually made long conversations exhausting instead of energizing. Some sections aren't accessible on regular tours because they require a certain level of physical aptitude and historical knowledge to navigate safely. But I think you'll appreciate seeing the defensive innovations your research discusses in theory. There was something in the way he said it that suggested a special privilege was being extended, and Emma felt genuinely flattered that he considered her worthy of accessing parts of his ancestral home that were off-limits to casual visitors. I'd love that, Emma replied, and she truly meant it. The chance to see medieval defense systems in person was a dream she never expected to fulfill so completely. Thank you for trusting me with parts of your home that must be incredibly precious to you. There was genuine gratitude in her voice, which Alexander found refreshing. Victoria had always taken luxury for granted, never understanding that privilege came with the responsibility to appreciate and preserve, not just enjoy. Tomorrow, then. We'll start early. There's a lot to see, and some areas are best explored when the natural light is strongest. Emma went to bed that night with her mind racing through everything she had learned about the castle's architecture in person versus what she had studied in books, but also with thoughts about Alexander that had nothing to do with academics and everything to do with the way he looked at her when she spoke about her passion for history, the way his voice softened when he talked about family traditions, the way she felt intellectually stimulated and somehow physically aware of him in a way that was entirely new to her experience. She fell asleep in a bed that had hosted centuries of dreamers and woke the next morning to the sound of rain against windows that had witnessed storms longer than most nations had existed. The morning brought breakfast in a smaller dining room that was more intimate without being any less elegant, with views of gardens where roses bloomed despite the Scottish weather that could shift from sunshine to storm in minutes without warning. Alexander appeared dressed in dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and made his eyes look more blue than gray. Emma found herself noticing details about his appearance that had nothing to do with professional courtesy and everything to do with an attraction she was trying not to acknowledge. Mixing business with pleasure had been a policy she'd upheld throughout her university years, when turning down dates had been a matter of keeping priorities in line. "Ready for your private tour?" Alexander asked, as Margaret served coffee, strong enough to wake the spirits of medieval ancestors and pastries that looked like works of art, disguised as breakfast. Emma nodded with enthusiasm that was only partially about the academic opportunity, and partially about spending the day with someone who made conversation feel like adventure instead of work. They began with areas open to public tours, but Alexander offered commentary only someone who had grown up hearing family stories about every tapestry, every suit of armor, every portrait lining the walls of rooms that were simultaneously museum and home could provide. The castle had originally been built as a defensive fortress during a time when Scottish independence was constantly threatened by English invasions. It was constructed on a rocky outcrop that provided natural defensive advantages, enhanced by human engineering Emma recognized from her studies, but had never seen implemented on such a scale. Alexander led her through the great hall where clan meetings had been held for centuries, up spiral staircases deliberately built clockwise to give right-handed defenders an advantage over attackers climbing upward, and through rooms where queens had slept while traveling through the Highlands during eras when political alliances were matters of life and death for entire clans. "This is where the tour guides stop," Alexander said as they reached a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands that looked original to the castle's construction. "But this is where the real defensive innovations begin." He produced an old iron key that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale and unlocked the door, revealing a passage carved directly into the castle's rocky foundation. It was lit by discreet modern lighting installed to preserve the medieval atmosphere, while ensuring safety for anyone brave enough to explore tunnels most visitors never knew existed. Emma felt a thrill of privilege and adventure as she followed him into the passage, narrow enough to brush shoulders but tall enough to walk upright, carved with a precision that demonstrated engineering capabilities far more advanced than most people imagined medieval builders possessed. The tunnel connected to a series of rooms that served different purposes during times of siege. Storage areas for food and weapons that could sustain inhabitants for months, chambers where valuables were hidden, and eventually an exit that emerged, half a mile from the castle in a location that allowed escape if the main fortress was compromised. Alexander's knowledge of every twist and turn was obvious, and Emma realized these passages weren't just historical curiosities to him. They were part of a legacy he had inherited, along with the responsibility to preserve it. "My grandfather brought me through these tunnels when I was 7, he said as they paused in a chamber once used to store grain during a 16th-century siege. "He wanted me to understand that owning a place like this comes with obligations that go beyond financial investment. Some responsibilities are passed down whether you want them or not," Emma replied, thinking of the farm in Vermont. Her father hoped she would eventually take over, despite her clear preference for academic pursuits over agricultural life. But some privileges are worth whatever obligations come with them. Alexander looked at her when she said that, and there was something in his expression that suggested he was hearing more in her words than she had intended to reveal. About her own struggles with duty versus desire, Obligation versus ambition. Safety versus adventure. They spent hours exploring parts of the castle that had never appeared in any guidebook, climbing spiral staircases that led to watchtowers with views stretching to the horizon, examining architectural details that represented defensive design, innovation centuries ahead of their time, and discussing historical context that brought academic knowledge to life in ways no textbook ever could. Emma found herself constantly taking mental notes, not just about medieval engineering, but about the way Alexander spoke of family history, with a mix of pride and burden that suggested a complicated relationship with a heritage that offered privilege but demanded sacrifices that didn't always align with personal desires. By the afternoon, when they emerged from the tunnels back into the main castle, Emma realized that what had begun as a professional tour had evolved into something more personal. The conversation flowed easily between historical facts and personal observations, between academic theories and life experiences that seemed to bridge the gap between her rural American background and his aristocratic British heritage in ways that should have been impossible, but somehow felt natural. There was a chemistry developing that had nothing to do with medieval architecture and everything to do with the way they looked at each other when discussing passion projects. The way silence became comfortable instead of awkward. The way casual touches while navigating narrow passages created a kind of awareness that was definitely not academic. "Would you like to see my favorite room in the castle?" Alexander asked as they returned to the main corridor, and there was something in his voice that suggested this was not an invitation he extended lightly. Emma nodded, curious about what space would be considered a private retreat by someone who owned a property that was itself a retreat from the demanding business life in London. He led her up the tower staircase to a room that was part library, part study. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held a collection focused on medieval history and art. Comfortable armchairs were positioned to catch the natural light from windows offering panoramic views, and a desk stood where he apparently handled business matters when staying at the castle. The room felt intensely personal in a way the rest of the castle, despite its beauty, felt more like a museum. There were photographs on the desk showing Alexander with family members at various stages of life, awards recognizing his contributions to historical preservation, and books that were clearly read often rather than displayed for appearance. "This is where I come when London becomes too much," he said, settling into a chair by the window with the kind of ease that spoke of many hours spent in that exact position. "Sometimes you need a place where you can remember who you were before the world decided who you should be." Emma understood exactly what he meant. She'd felt a similar tension between the person she was naturally and the person she had to become to reach academic goals that demanded constant proof, effort, and competition in a world that wasn't always welcoming to small-town Americans who relied on scholarships instead of family connections to access opportunity. "It must be comforting to have a place with so much family history," she said, settling into the chair opposite him and noticing how the afternoon light streaming through the windows brought out flecks of blue in his eyes that shifted with the lighting and his mood. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have ancestors who left behind something more substantial than debt and good intentions." "Inherited wealth comes with its own pressures," Alexander replied, and there was honesty in his voice that suggested he didn't often discuss the complexities of his position with people who could understand without judgment or expectation. "When every decision you make affects not just your own life but a legacy that stretches back centuries, spontaneity becomes a luxury you can't afford. Every relationship, every business move, every personal choice is filtered through questions about its impact on family reputation, financial stability, and historical preservation." Emma heard something in the way he said "every relationship" that hinted at recent personal experience with complications far beyond theoretical concerns. "Is that why you're here alone instead of with?" she began to ask, then stopped. Herself, questioning someone's personal relationships felt inappropriate, even as the conversation had clearly moved beyond formal boundaries. "Ex-wife," Alexander finished for her with a faint smile that couldn't quite hide the sadness beneath the admission. "Victoria decided that being married to someone with my kind of responsibilities wasn't what she wanted for her life. She chose my business partner, who apparently offered more excitement and less historical baggage." There was acceptance in his voice, but also pain, still fresh enough to be carefully managed rather than fully healed. Emma felt a sudden surge of anger toward a woman she'd never met, someone who had been privileged enough to be loved by a man like Alexander, and had thrown it away to chase excitement that likely wouldn't last beyond the honeymoon phase. "I'm sorry," she said simply, because platitudes about being better off without someone who didn't appreciate him would sound condescending, coming from someone who barely knew him, even if she was thinking exactly that. "Thank you. It's still relatively fresh. The divorce was finalized just 6 months ago." Alexander said this while looking out the window at the gardens, where roses continued to bloom despite the changing seasons. Emma noticed there was no bitterness in his voice as he spoke of a betrayal that would have broken lesser men. "Were you married long?" Emma asked, then immediately worried she was venturing into territory too personal. But Alexander seemed willing to discuss a situation that had clearly been a major factor in his decision to spend time in Scotland, rather than in London, where reminders of a failed marriage would be impossible to avoid. 8 months. We'd known each other for 3 years, but apparently she'd been interested in Marcus for most of that time and only married me because... He paused, weighing how much to reveal to someone who was both a guest in his home and a professional contact whose discretion in academic circles could affect his reputation. "Because you represented the security she wanted more than the love she felt," Emma finished quietly, and Alexander looked at her sharply. The accuracy of her observation suggested either uncommon insight into human nature or personal experience with similar situations. "Exactly. I thought I was marrying someone who shared my values, someone who understood that some things matter more than instant gratification. I was wrong." The simplicity of the statement carried a weight that elaborate explanations couldn't match, and Emma found herself wanting to offer comfort in ways that went far beyond the appropriate boundaries of a relationship that was supposed to be professional courtesy, extended to a visiting scholar. "Not everyone understands that love requires more than chemistry," Emma said carefully, walking the line between offering support and revealing her own thoughts on relationships, thoughts she'd kept guarded during her university years, when most men her age seemed interested in thrill over depth, conquest over partnership, taking rather than building something that could last beyond initial attraction. Some people confuse intensity with depth, variety with richness, novelty with growth. Alexander studied her face as she spoke, and Emma realized she'd revealed more about her philosophy of love than she'd intended. But there was something in his expression that suggested he was hearing exactly what he needed to hear from someone who understood that real connection required more than physical attraction or social compatibility. "You speak like someone who's given considerable thought to what makes relationships last," Alexander observed, and there was curiosity in his voice that went beyond polite interest. Emma felt warmth rise in her cheeks. She was about to admit to this sophisticated man that her experience with relationships was more theoretical than practical. She'd spent so many years focused on academic achievement that she'd never allowed herself to explore romantic connections that might distract from carefully planned goals. "I've watched my friends make choices based on excitement that faded quickly, and I've seen how much damage is done when people confuse attraction with compatibility," she said carefully. It was true even if it didn't directly address his implied question about her personal experience. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in thoughts that were becoming more personal and less professional, despite Emma's conscious efforts to maintain appropriate boundaries with someone who was not only her host, but also someone whose recommendation could open doors in the academic world she was working so hard to enter. Outside the windows, the Scottish afternoon was fading into evening, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold that made the landscape look like something out of a romantic painting. And Emma found herself thinking that this was exactly the kind of moment she'd read about in novels but never expected to experience in real life, sitting in a castle tower with a man who was both accessible and mysterious, familiar and exotic. "Would you like to stay for dinner again?" Alexander asked. And Emma heard something in his voice that suggested this wasn't just polite hospitality. It was a genuine desire for her company, something that had nothing to do with academic courtesy and everything to do with the personal connection that had developed over a day, spent exploring hidden parts of his family legacy. "I'd love to," Emma replied, and she truly meant it. The thought of returning to her solitary room to eat dinner alone with only books for company suddenly felt unpleasant compared to spending another evening in conversation that challenged her intellectually, while also making her feel more interesting and attractive than she'd ever felt before. Dinner that night was more intimate than the previous evening, served in a smaller dining room that Alexander explained was where the family took private meals when not entertaining guests formally. The table was set for two, encouraging conversation, rather than the kind of formal dining experience that could easily become performance instead of genuine connection. Margaret had prepared salmon caught that morning in the loch visible from the castle windows, vegetables grown in the castle gardens, and wine Alexander had selected from a cellar containing bottles aged for decades in a temperature-controlled environment that preserved flavors impossible to replicate with modern techniques. Emma found herself fully relaxed for the first time since arriving in Scotland, helped by wine that was better than anything she'd ever tasted, and an atmosphere that somehow managed to be both elegant and comfortable, formal enough to feel special, yet intimate enough to feel natural. Alexander proved to be an exceptional dinner companion, able to discuss topics ranging from medieval poetry to contemporary politics, from art history to travel experiences, from family traditions to personal dreams. The conversation flowed with such ease that hours passed like minutes, without awkward silences or forced topics, the kind that had defined most of Emma's social interactions during her university years. "Tell me about your plans after this research trip," Alexander asked during dessert, a chocolate creation Margaret had apparently made especially after noticing Emma's fondness for sweets the night before. "Will you return to Vermont to continue your studies, or are there other opportunities you're considering?" There was genuine interest in his voice, more than polite curiosity, and Emma found herself describing academic goals she rarely shared, because most people found them boring or intimidating, but Alexander listened with a kind of attentiveness that made her feel her ambitions weren't just valid, but fascinating. "I'm hoping to complete a PhD in medieval studies, focusing on the evolution of defensive architecture across European regions," Emma explained, trying not to notice how the candlelight cast shadows across Alexander's face in ways that emphasized his strong jawline and made his eyes appear darker, more intense. "My ultimate goal is to work in historical preservation, maybe with UNESCO or a similar organization that focuses on protecting architectural heritage that tells stories about civilizations we can still learn from." She said it with a passion that was unmistakable, because historical preservation wasn't just a career goal for her. It was a personal mission rooted in the belief that understanding the past was essential to making wise decisions about the future. "That's exactly the kind of work the world needs more of," Alexander replied, and there was respect in his voice that made Emma feel proud of the choices she'd made to prioritize education over easier paths that might have offered quicker rewards. "So many historically significant sites are being lost because people in power don't understand that architecture is the autobiography of human civilization. Once those buildings are gone, the stories they tell are lost forever." Emma felt a surge of recognition. This was the very philosophy that had driven her academic pursuits. Hearing it expressed by someone who clearly understood both the theoretical importance and the practical challenges of historical preservation made her feel less alone in a pursuit that often seemed impractical to those who measured success only in financial terms. "And you?" Emma asked, realizing she knew very little about how Alexander balanced inherited responsibilities with personal ambitions, how someone with his resources and connections chose to spend his time and energy when financial necessity wasn't a driving factor in decision-making. "Do you ever think about focusing entirely on historical preservation instead of managing the family business empire?" There was genuine curiosity in her question. She'd noticed the real passion in his voice when discussing the castle's history and his medieval art collection. It felt like more than duty or hobby. It bordered on vocation, something she recognized in herself when talking about architectural preservation. "Every day," Alexander admitted, with a surprising honesty that caught Emma off guard. She'd expected a diplomatic answer that acknowledged both responsibilities without revealing personal preferences that might be seen as criticism of family expectations. "Business responsibilities pay for the preservation projects, but Preserving places like this castle is what gives meaning to wealth that was inherited rather than earned. If I could choose freely without considering family obligations, I'd probably focus entirely on maintaining and protecting medieval sites that are in danger of being lost to development or neglect. Emma heard the melancholy in his voice, speaking of roads not taken, choices restricted by circumstances beyond his control, dreams that were compatible with his resources but not with expectations. As the evening progressed, Emma became increasingly aware that their conversation had moved well beyond professional courtesy. It was edging into territory that could complicate the working relationship that was supposed to be the focus of her time in Scotland. Alexander wasn't just knowledgeable, wealthy, and a generous host. He was someone who shared her passion for history. Someone who understood that some things mattered more than instant gratification. Someone who looked at her when she spoke as if her words mattered more than just professional networking. There was chemistry developing that had nothing to do with medieval architecture and everything to do with the way he smiled when she made observations that amused him, the way his voice softened when the conversation turned personal, the way she found herself noticing details about his appearance that were definitely not academic. "I should probably let you get some rest," Alexander said as the dining room clock struck 11, though neither of them had shown any sign of wanting the night to end. "Tomorrow I'll show you a manuscript collection that includes original architectural plans for several Scottish castles, including modifications made to this one over the centuries. Some of the documents have never been studied by outside researchers. They contain information about hidden passages and defensive strategies that were considered family secrets until recently." Emma felt a rush of excitement at the prospect of accessing primary sources that could provide material for research papers capable of establishing her reputation in the academic community. But she also felt a pang of disappointment that the evening was ending, because spending time with Alexander was becoming a pleasure rather than a professional obligation. "That sounds incredible," Emma replied, rising from the table with movements that felt reluctant. Returning to her solitary room after hours of engaging conversation felt more like punishment than a natural end to a lovely evening. "Thank you again for sharing so much of your family history with me. I know access like this is a privilege most researchers never receive." There was genuine gratitude in her voice, but also an awareness that she was stepping away from someone who had made her feel more interesting, more attractive, and more intellectually stimulated than anyone ever had before. And tomorrow would be one day less of her week in Scotland, one day closer to returning to her life in Vermont, which suddenly felt small and limiting compared to the possibilities she was beginning to imagine. "Thank you for being someone worth sharing it with," Alexander replied, and there was something in his voice that made Emma look at him more carefully. She saw an expression that wasn't just polite appreciation but something deeper, speaking of loneliness being temporarily filled by her presence, of a connection developing despite both their efforts to maintain professional boundaries. For a moment that lasted longer than either of them intended, they stood at the doorway looking at each other with a kind of awareness that was becoming impossible to ignore or dismiss as a misinterpretation of friendly courtesy extended to an academic guest. Emma went to bed that night with her mind racing through thoughts that had little to do with medieval architecture and everything to do with the way Alexander had looked at her when she laughed at something he said, the way his hand had briefly touched hers when reaching for the wine bottle, the way their conversation had flowed with a kind of ease that made her feel as if she'd known him for years instead of days. She fell asleep wondering what it would be like to live permanently in a place like this castle, to wake up every morning with someone who shared her passion for history, to build a life with someone who understood that some things were worth preserving, regardless of cost or convenience. The third day brought a morning that was crisp and clear, with sunlight streaming through windows that revealed dust particles, dancing in air scented with ancient wood and stone that had absorbed centuries of human habitation. Emma found Alexander waiting in the library, manuscripts spread across a reading table illuminated by a combination of natural light and specialized lamps that provided brightness without damaging the delicate parchment, older than any European settlement in America. The documents he showed her were treasures that belonged in museums, architectural plans drawn by hand with a precision modern drafting tools couldn't improve. sketches showing defensive innovations centuries ahead of their time, and maps revealing the locations of hidden passages and secret chambers known only to family members and the most trusted servants. These plans show the modifications made to the castle during the 16th century, when gunpowder was changing the nature of warfare, Alexander explained, pointing to details Emma would have missed without the guidance of someone who had grown up hearing stories about every line and symbol. My ancestor had to adapt medieval fortifications to defend against cannons, which required completely different architectural strategies than defending against arrows and siege engines. Emma leaned in closer to examine the details, drawn in by ink that had faded to brown but remained legible after 4 centuries. She was intensely aware of Alexander's proximity, the warmth radiating from his body, the subtle scent of his cologne, distinctly masculine and unlike anything the college boys in Vermont ever wore. As the morning progressed, Emma realized she was struggling to concentrate on the manuscripts. Alexander's presence was becoming a distraction, one that was definitely not professional. Every time he leaned across the table to point out architectural features, she found herself noticing the way his hair fell across his forehead, the way his hands moved when explaining complex engineering concepts, the way his voice grew more animated when discussing the innovations his ancestors had implemented to protect their home and their people. There was something about the combination of intelligence, passion, and physical presence that was affecting her ability to maintain the emotional distance she'd cultivated during her university years, when romantic complications were avoided to protect academic goals. "Are you feeling all right?" Alexander asked when he noticed Emma seemed distracted. The concern in his voice was genuine, not just polite. He had observed that her attention was drifting, despite her obvious fascination with the historical documents that most researchers would consider a once-in-a-lifetime privilege to examine. "You seem different today, less focused on the manuscript details than I would have expected. Given your clear passion for the subject." Emma felt warmth rise in her cheeks. She couldn't explain that her distraction had nothing to do with a lack of interest in medieval architecture and everything to do with the growing awareness that she was developing feelings for someone who was supposed to be a professional contact, not a personal one. "I'm fine," Emma replied, trying to sound casual despite knowing her voice wasn't entirely steady. Her ability to concentrate was being undermined by thoughts that had nothing to do with academic research and everything to do with wondering what it would be like to be kissed by someone who looked at her as if she were more captivating than any historical artifact, just overwhelmed by access to documents I've only ever read about in secondary sources. Sometimes reality is more intense than theory. It was true, though not the whole truth. The reality overwhelming her had less to do with manuscripts and more to do with the way Alexander smiled when she made observations that pleased him, the way his eyes seemed to see more than just a visiting academic. Alexander studied her face with an expression that suggested he was hearing more in her words than she intended to reveal. Emma saw the moment when professional concern shifted into personal awareness, when he seemed to recognize that the tension between them wasn't just academic excitement, but something more personal and potentially complicated. "Emma," he said quietly, and the way he said her name was different than it had been in previous days, laden with implications that made her heart beat faster, despite her conscious efforts to maintain the composure that had served her well through years of turning down romantic opportunities to focus on career preparation. "Yes?" Emma replied, though the word came out as a whisper rather than normal speech. Something in Alexander's expression made it hard to breathe normally, made her aware that whatever was happening between them was approaching a point where the professional boundaries they'd both been maintaining would need to be either reinforced or abandoned entirely. For a moment, that felt longer than the actual time that passed, they looked at each other across a table covered in medieval manuscripts. Emma felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff. One more step would change everything about the carefully planned life that had brought her to this castle, to this moment, to this choice that could define not just the remaining days in Scotland, but possibly the direction of her entire future. If you're feeling the tension building between them, drop a heart in the comments, because what happens next will change everything. Would you like to take a break from the manuscripts and see a part of the estate most visitors never get to see? Alexander asked, and there was something in his voice that suggested this invitation was different from previous tours, more personal, and potentially more revealing about both the castle and the man who had inherited the responsibility of preserving it. Emma nodded. She needed a distraction from thoughts that were becoming impossible to ignore, and because spending time with Alexander had become a pleasure she looked forward to more than the professional obligation her research in Scotland was supposed to fulfill, Alexander led her through corridors she hadn't seen before, descending stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use, into subterranean chambers that were part of the castle's original foundation. These rooms had been converted over the centuries to serve various purposes as the needs of the inhabitants changed with political and social developments that shaped life in the Scottish Highlands. The rooms were cool and quiet, with an atmosphere that spoke of secrets kept and stories preserved. They were lit, with modern lighting carefully installed to ensure safety without destroying the medieval ambiance that made exploration feel like a journey through time rather than a simple tour of a historic property. This chamber was used to store weapons during times when the castle was under threat, Alexander explained, showing her a room where the walls had once been lined with shelves holding swords, arrows, and other implements of medieval warfare. Now empty, the room still retained a sense of readiness that spoke of times when survival depended on the ability to defend against enemies who could attack with little warning. During peaceful periods, it served as a wine cellar. The temperature stays constant year-round, perfect for aging barrels that produced some of the finest whiskies in Scotland. Emma could imagine the chamber filled with provisions to sustain the castle's inhabitants during a siege. She could almost hear the echoes of preparation and planning that would have taken place when the threat of attack made every decision a matter of life and death for everyone within the walls. And this, Alexander said, as he opened a heavy wooden door that required an old-fashioned key that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale, is my private retreat when even the castle becomes too public. The room he revealed was small but comfortable, furnished with antique chairs that looked original to the castle's construction, a bookshelf filled with volumes clearly read often, rather than displayed for show, and a fireplace where logs were already stacked and ready to be lit. There was something intimate about the space, clearly personal, not part of the castle shared with staff or occasional visitors. Emma felt privileged to be invited into an area likely seen by very few. "It's beautiful," Emma said, taking in a room that managed to be both elegant and cozy, sophisticated and warm, formal and intimate in ways that reflected a personality she was beginning to understand was far more complex than she had initially perceived. "You must spend a lot of time here when you're in residence," Alexander nodded as he settled into a chair that showed signs of frequent use, gesturing for Emma to take the seat opposite him in an arrangement that encouraged conversation rather than formal interaction. When London becomes overwhelming, business pressures, social obligations, reminders of a marriage that failed, I come here to remember who I am when stripped of external expectations and other people's definitions of success. Emma understood exactly what he meant. She had felt a similar need to escape the pressures that came with being a scholarship student who constantly had to prove her worth for opportunities other students took for granted. The pressure to excel was both a motivation and a burden, because failure wasn't an option when family sacrifices had made her education possible. Sometimes, you need a space where you can just be yourself, without performing for anyone else. She said it as she settled into a chair that was surprisingly comfortable despite its obvious age, recognizing that the conversation was drifting into territory that was definitely personal, rather than professional. "Exactly," Alexander replied, and there was relief in his voice. Like he rarely encountered people who understood the complexities of living a life where external expectations often clashed with personal desires, where inherited privilege came with obligations that didn't always align with individual happiness. Most people assume wealth and status automatically equal fulfillment, but sometimes privilege comes with costs that aren't immediately obvious to outsiders. Emma heard loneliness in his voice, a different kind of loneliness than the one she had chosen during her university years. His was the kind that came from being surrounded by people who wanted something from him. rather than people who valued him for who he was. For the next hour, they spoke with a kind of openness that was new to both of them. They shared thoughts about the pressure to live up to others' expectations, the challenges of pursuing goals that required personal sacrifice, and the question of whether achieving success, defined by external standards, was worth the cost in personal happiness and authentic relationships. Emma found herself revealing insecurities about being a small-town girl in an academic world where connections often mattered more than competence, fears about whether she was smart enough to succeed in a field where she'd be competing with people who had advantages she could never replicate. Alexander shared the pressures of inherited wealth, the responsibility of maintaining a family legacy, the expectation that his personal choices would always consider the impact on a business empire employing thousands, and the loneliness of never being entirely sure whether people were interested in him as a person or as a stepping stone to social or financial gain. Victoria married me because I represented security and status, he said with a painful honesty. I thought shared values and intellectual compatibility would be enough to build a lasting relationship, but I was wrong about what she really wanted from marriage. She was wrong about what marriage should be, Emma replied firmly, and there was indignation in her voice that surprised Alexander. Most people offered sympathy or platitudes when he spoke of the divorce, not anger directed at the woman who had chosen to end their relationship. Marriage should be a partnership between people who value each other enough to choose commitment over convenience, depth over excitement, building something lasting over chasing instant gratification. She said it with conviction, born from years of watching friends make romantic choices based on attraction rather than compatibility. Chemistry instead of character, excitement instead of stability. You have very strong opinions about relationships for someone who, Alexander began, then stopped himself. He realized he was about to make an assumption about Emma's personal experience that might not be accurate and could intrude on a conversation that was becoming more honest and intimate than any he'd had in months since the divorce was finalized. For someone who's clearly thought carefully about what makes relationships work, he finished gently. But Emma heard what he had been about to say and felt a flush of embarrassment discussing love with the authority of someone whose knowledge was theoretical rather than practical. For someone who's never been in a serious relationship, she finished for him, deciding that honesty was better than letting him wonder about experience she didn't have. I spent most of my university years focused on academics and avoiding romantic complications that could interfere with career goals, so my understanding of love is more theoretical than lived. She said it while looking down at her hands in her lap, rather than meeting his eyes, because admitting to a sophisticated man that she was 23 and had never been in love felt more like confessing inadequacy than explaining a strategic choice. That explains why your perspective is so clear, Alexander said gently. There was no condescension in his voice, only respect for choices that had required discipline and sacrifice most people her age wouldn't have been willing to make. Most people learn about relationships through trial and error, which leaves them with assumptions and bad habits that cloud their judgment about what a healthy partnership should look like. You've had the chance to observe without being influenced by personal disappointments. That can make it hard to see clearly. Emma looked up and met his eyes and saw admiration instead of pity, respect instead of amusement, and something else that felt like interest that was definitely not professional. Is that why you're telling me about Victoria? Because I have an outsider's perspective that might be useful? Emma asked, though she suspected the conversation wasn't really about seeking advice from a detached observer. It was about a connection that was developing between them. Despite their best efforts to maintain appropriate boundaries, there was chemistry that was becoming impossible to ignore, a growing awareness with every conversation that revealed more about their personalities, values, and dreams, aligning in ways that seemed statistically improbable between people from such different backgrounds and life experiences. I'm telling you about Victoria because I trust you, Alexander replied, and the simplicity of the statement carried a weight that elaborate explanations couldn't convey, and because I want you to understand that my interest in you has nothing to do with rebound relationships or trying to prove I can attract someone after being rejected by my wife. My interest in you is based on the fact that you're the most intelligent, passionate, genuine person I've met in longer than I can remember." Emma felt her breath catch in her throat. He was no longer talking about academic respect or professional courtesy. He was speaking about personal attraction, and it was mutual and growing stronger, despite practical complications that should have made such feelings impossible. "Alexander," Emma said quietly, and the way she said his name was different than it had been in previous days, laden with the awareness that whatever was happening between them was approaching a point where decisions would need to be made. Decisions about whether to pursue a connection that could complicate everything about the carefully planned academic trip that was supposed to be focused entirely on professional development, not personal relationships. "I don't know what's happening here, but I know it's not what either of us planned when I came to Scotland to study medieval architecture." "No," Alexander agreed, moving from his chair to kneel beside her in a gesture that was intimate, without being presumptuous, close enough for her to see flecks of gold in his blue eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable revealing about feelings she was trying not to acknowledge. "It's not what I planned either, but sometimes the best things in life are the ones that happen when you're not looking for them, when you're focused on something else entirely and discover that what you really needed was standing right in front of you all along." Emma felt like she could barely breathe. The closeness made it impossible to think clearly about the practical considerations that should have been guiding her behavior during a research trip meant to launch her academic career, not potentially derail it. "I'm only here for 4 more days," Emma said, though the words felt inadequate to express the complicated feelings developing faster than she'd ever imagined possible, deeper than anything she'd experienced during her university years, when avoiding romantic complications had been easier than learning to navigate emotions that could be overwhelming in their intensity. "After that, I go back to Vermont and you go back to London, and this becomes a memory instead of something that could grow into whatever it might become if circumstances were different." She said it like she was reminding herself of the practical realities that should have been keeping her heart from racing every time Alexander looked at her with an expression that suggested he was thinking about kissing her. "Days might be enough," Alexander said softly, reaching to touch her hand in a gesture that was gentle, but sent a current of electricity through her entire body, making her understand, for the first time, why people wrote poetry about simple touches that could change everything in a single moment. 4 days might be a beginning instead of an end. If we're brave enough to choose possibility over safety, the unknown over the familiar, hope over fear. Emma looked into his eyes and saw an invitation that was both thrilling and terrifying, because accepting it would mean abandoning the careful plans that had governed her life for years in favor of an adventure that could lead anywhere or nowhere, but would undeniably change everything about the future she'd been building through determination, sacrifice, and singular focus. And suddenly, all those goals seemed less important than the man looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Emma," Alexander whispered, his hand moving from hers to gently touch her face. She closed her eyes. The sensation was almost too intense to bear. His fingers traced the line of her cheek with reverence, speaking of an attraction that went far beyond the physical, deeper than chemistry, something that felt like a soul recognizing its match after a lifetime of waiting. "I know this is complicated. I know the timing is wrong. I know we come from different worlds and have responsibilities that make a relationship difficult, but I also know I haven't felt this connected to another person in years, maybe ever, and if we let fear of complications stop us from exploring what this could become, we might regret that choice for the rest of our lives." Emma opened her eyes to find his face inches from hers, close enough to see the small scar above his left eyebrow that surely had a story, close enough to notice his breath wasn't entirely steady, close enough to realize he was waiting for her to choose whether to close the remaining distance between them or step back into the safety of professional boundaries that were becoming harder to maintain with every moment charged with possibility and promise and terrifying intensity for a moment that felt like eternity. She considered the practical arguments against letting personal feelings interfere with the academic opportunity that represented years of work and sacrifice, a future she had planned and prepared for with the discipline that had required saying no to everything, that might distract from her ultimate goals. Then, she thought about the life those plans represented, years spent studying the history others had lived while remaining an observer instead of a participant, nights in the library reading about adventures and romances and great passions that other people experienced, while she stayed focused on achievements that were intellectually satisfying but emotionally hollow, a future that was safe and predictable and potentially lonely, despite the professional success she was working so hard to achieve. What if you're wrong about this? Emma asked, because fear was legitimate even when the opportunity was extraordinary. Because making choices that could change the direction of an entire life required acknowledging that outcomes weren't guaranteed, no matter how intense the feelings that made rational decision-making nearly impossible. What if I'm right? Alexander countered, his hand still resting on her cheek, with a tenderness that made her want to lean into the touch. Like a flower turning toward sunlight, his voice carried the conviction of someone who had lived long enough to know the difference between fleeting attraction and a connection that could last a lifetime if nurtured properly. What if we're both right about feeling that this could be something extraordinary? Something that doesn't happen often enough to be dismissed because of timing or logistics or fear of making mistakes that are inevitable when two people try to build something meaningful together? Emma felt tears begin to form because the choice was both obvious and impossible. Accepting his invitation meant abandoning the safety she had spent years constructing in favor of the unknown, which could be wonderful or devastating. I've never felt anything like this, Emma admitted, her honesty leaving her completely vulnerable. She wasn't just confessing attraction, she was admitting inexperience that made her feel inadequate next to a man who had traveled the world, been married, and clearly knew far more about relationships than she could claim after years of avoiding romantic complications. I don't know how to do this, how to balance feelings that are stronger than anything I expected with the responsibilities that brought me here in the first place. I don't know how to choose between the safe path I've been following and the adventure you're offering, without knowing where it leads or what it might cost. No one knows how to do this, Alexander replied, moving closer until his forehead touched hers, a gesture that was intimate without being presumptuous, comforting without being condescending. It was honest about uncertainty while expressing confidence that some risks were worth taking, even without guarantees. Love, and that's what this is, Emma. Whatever else happens, love is always a leap of faith. It's choosing to trust someone with your heart, knowing they have the power to break it. It's deciding to choose hope over fear, even though hope can lead to disappointment in ways safety never will. But the disappointment of trying and failing is different from the regret of never trying. Emma felt something shift inside her when he used the word love with such certainty. She had spent years believing love was an emotion that required time to develop, trust that had to be built gradually through shared experiences and proven compatibility, a feeling that would announce itself clearly, not arrive with overwhelming intensity. But looking into Alexander's eyes, she understood that sometimes hearts recognize their match instantly, without logical explanation or gradual development, with a certainty that bypasses rational thought and speaks directly to instinct, older and wiser than the conscious mind still analyzing practical complications and potential consequences. Alexander, Emma whispered, and his name felt different in her mouth now, spoken with the recognition of feelings she had been trying to deny since the first night. When conversation had flowed so easily it made hours feel like minutes, since the first moment he had looked at her with interest that went beyond professional courtesy and made her feel more attractive and interesting than she'd ever felt before. I think I'm falling in love with you too, and it scares me, because I've never let anyone matter enough to have the power to hurt me, and because I don't know how to be someone's girlfriend or partner when I've spent my entire adult life being independent and focused on goals that didn't include anyone else. Then we'll learn together, Alexander said, before closing the remaining distance between them and kissing her with a gentleness that gradually deepened as she responded with a passion that surprised them both, because theoretical knowledge of kissing was nothing compared to the reality of lips that were soft and warm and skilled in ways that made her understand why people wrote songs about simple, physical contact that could communicate emotions words were inadequate to express. Emma found herself responding with a passion she hadn't known she possessed, her hands tangling in his hair that was softer than she'd imagined, her body pressing closer to his in movements that were instinctive rather than planned, guided by feelings stronger than rational thought or practical considerations. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily and looking at each other with a mix of wonder and desire and slight disbelief, that a single kiss could be so intense, it changed everything about their relationship in the span of a few minutes. Emma realized she had made a choice without consciously deciding. Her response to his kiss had been the answer to the question of whether to pursue a connection that could complicate everything about her carefully planned future. "What happens now?" she asked, because suddenly the 4 days remaining in Scotland felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Because leaving to return to Vermont at the end of the week would mean ending something that was just beginning. Because continuing a relationship across an ocean seemed impossible, but leaving felt even more impossible. "Now we have 4 days to see what this could become," Alexander replied, his hands moving to frame her face with a tenderness that made her feel precious instead of fragile, desired instead of vulnerable, valued instead of conquered. 4 days to explore a connection that feels like it could be the foundation for something lasting, something worth whatever challenges come with distance and different life circumstances and practical complications we'll have to figure out together. Emma nodded, because she knew some opportunities only come once. Some connections are rare enough to justify taking risks that would normally seem foolish. Some people are worth changing plans for, especially when those plans no longer seem as important as the possibility standing right in front of her. "I want to try," Emma said with a conviction that surprised her, because she had spent so many years avoiding emotional risks in favor of safe choices that guaranteed specific outcomes, rather than hoping for happiness that wasn't guaranteed but was possible. "I want these 4 days. I want to see what happens after that. And I want to find out what it feels like to choose adventure over safety for the first time in my life." Alexander smiled at her words, smile that was a mix of relief and joy and something that looked like wonder. Apparently, even sophisticated men who owned castles and ran business empires could be uncertain about whether their feelings were returned by small-town American graduate students who had somehow captured their hearts in a matter of days as afternoon turned into evening, filled with conversations that ranged from practical logistics to philosophical explorations of what love meant to two people who had spent years protecting themselves from exactly this kind of emotional vulnerability. Emma realized that falling in love felt both like coming home and embarking on the greatest adventure of her life. Hinder showed her parts of the castle not even private tours included. He shared family stories that revealed vulnerabilities, dreams and fears he had never discussed with Victoria during 8 months of marriage, and he touched her with a reverence that made her understand why people described love as a sacred experience rather than a simple emotional response to physical attraction. That night, they dined in his private quarters instead of the formal dining room, a quiet meal prepared by Margaret but served by Alexander himself, a gesture that spoke of wanting to care for someone rather than be cared for, to give rather than receive, to make someone else's comfort and happiness a priority, rather than expect to be the center of attention. As wealth and status often guaranteed, Emma found herself fully relaxed for the first time since admitting the feelings she had been trying to deny. She discovered that being loved felt like permission to be entirely herself, rather than a version of herself designed to meet others' expectations or achieve specific goals. "Tell me about your family," Alexander said as they sat together in front of the fire, its dancing shadows cast across walls that had witnessed centuries of conversations about love and war and dreams and disappointments, universal human experiences, regardless of historical period or social circumstance. "I want to understand where you come from. What shaped you into the person who managed to capture my heart so completely in a matter of days? When I thought Victoria had damaged my ability to trust someone enough to fall in love again," Emma leaned against his shoulder in a position that felt natural despite the newness of physical intimacy that was still overwhelming in its intensity. She began to share stories about growing up in Vermont, stories she had never told anyone because they seemed too ordinary to be interesting to people who hadn't experienced rural life shaped by seasons, agricultural rhythms, and community connections that were different from urban relationships. She told him about her father, who had worked 17-hour days to keep the farm profitable enough to support a family of 2. After her mother died, about neighbors who helped with the harvest when Thomas injured his back and couldn't work for 3 weeks, about a community that contributed money to her college fund because everyone understood that Emma's intelligence was a resource that could benefit more than just the Sullivan family. Alexander listened with complete and respectful attention, asking questions that showed he understood her background wasn't a limitation to be overcome, but a foundation that had given her values, work ethic, and appreciation for simple pleasures, things people like Victoria took for granted because they had never known anything different. Your father must be worried about you being so far from home with people he doesn't know, Alexander observed, and the concern in his voice was genuine. He could imagine the protective instincts of a man who had raised his daughter alone, watching her travel to a foreign country to stay with wealthy strangers whose intentions he couldn't personally evaluate. He must be wondering whether I've taken advantage of your hospitality, or whether my intentions are honorable, especially now that he stopped, realizing he was referring to the shift in their relationship that had happened only hours earlier and was still too fragile to define. Now that what? Emma asked, looking up to meet his eyes, and seeing uncertainty that surprised her. She had assumed a man with Alexander's experience and sophistication would be more confident about navigating the development of a romantic relationship. Now that you've become more than an academic guest, he replied carefully, as if testing the words to see how they sounded aloud. Now that you've become, what have you become, Emma? Because I know what I hope you are, but I don't want to assume anything about feelings you may or may not be having. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of defining something too new to categorize easily. But Emma knew honesty was more important than protecting herself from potential embarrassment. I think I've become the woman who's falling in love with the man who owns this castle, she said, her voice steadier than she expected, considering she was navigating emotional territory that was completely new to her. I think I've become someone willing to risk the heart I've carefully protected for years because you make me feel like it's worth the risk of being hurt, if it means the possibility of being truly loved. Her words seemed to release something in Alexander that he had been holding back since the first night, when he realized that conversation with Emma was different from any social interaction he'd had in months. Since the first moment he saw that she looked at him as a person, not as an opportunity or a title or a bank account. He pulled her closer in an embrace that was both protective and possessive, burying his face in her hair that smelled of simple shampoo and something uniquely Emma, a blend of innocence and intelligence that had become addictive in less than a week of knowing her. Then let's see where these 4 days take us, he murmured, against the top of her head, his voice filled with promise that made Emma feel like she was standing at the edge of an adventure that could redefine everything about the life she had so carefully planned. Let's see if a love that feels impossible can become a love worth whatever we have to sacrifice to keep it. Emma closed her eyes and allowed herself to believe for the first time in her life that maybe some dreams were too big for practical plans, that maybe some people were worth rewriting an entire future for, that maybe some connections were too strong to be limited by geography or age, differences, or any obstacle the world might place in their path. If you're invested in this love story that's changing 2 lives forever, leave a like and comment where you're watching from, because Emma and Alexander still have 4 days to discover whether love can conquer all the impossibilities that stand between them.